All right, welcome back. Today we pick up a new chapter in 2 Samuel, in 2 Samuel chapter 6. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart, and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, who was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. And David and all the house of Israel were making merry before the Lord, with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came into the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah. God struck him down there because of his error, and he died there beside the ark of God. And David was angry because the Lord had burst forth against Uzzah, and that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, "How can the ark of the Lord come to me?" So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David. But David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. And it was told King David, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God." So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. And David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place, inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and distributed among all the peoples, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his house. And David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David, and she said, "How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself." And David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord, who chose me above your father and above all his house, to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord. And I will make merry before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor." And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. Thus far, chapter 6. Okay, just by a quick overview of chapter 6, now that we've read it, chapter 6 actually ties together with chapter 7, and they form a unit. This unit of chapters 6 and 7 are all about the Ark of the Covenant, and how the Ark of the Covenant came to rest in Jerusalem, the city of David, how David moved it there, what David did to get it into the city, and so forth, which you've heard a portion of that already in chapter 6. You're going to hear more about the Ark and about how David served God and became anointed as God's chosen servant, I guess, to create this city of David and to become the lineage, the predecessor of the Christ who came to serve all Israel. While David was the one to move the ark, it was God's purpose to bring it there. And we can find this actually in Psalm 78. So I'm going to have you turn to Psalm 78, verse 68. "But he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion, which he loves. He built his sanctuary like the high heavens, like the earth, which he has founded forever. He chose David his servant and took him from the sheepfolds. From following the nursing ewes he brought him, to shepherd Jacob his people, Israel his inheritance. With upright heart he shepherded them and guided them with his skillful hand. So that's Psalm 78, verses 68 through 72. We can also find this in Psalm 132, but I'm going to come back to that one because really the whole of Psalm 132 kind of is the umbrella that overlooks or that kind of covers over chapters 6 and 7. So we'll return to that and look at it more in length in just a moment here. But back to the ark coming into the city of Jerusalem. That was also promised by God through Moses. And we'll find that in a couple of places too, mostly in the book of Deuteronomy. So I'm going to have you turn to Deuteronomy chapter 12. We're going to look at verse 5. It says, "But you shall seek the place that the Lord your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you shall go, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contribution that you present, your vow offerings, your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock." I'm going to skip ahead. I'm also going to share with you verse 11. It says, "Then to the place that the Lord your God will choose, to make his name dwell there. There you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the contribution that you present, and all your finest vow offerings that you vow to the Lord." Actually, the author of the commentary cites several places. We're going to skip ahead now to Deuteronomy 14, just a couple of short chapters. So God tells Moses, look, there's going to be a place that gets established where people bring their offerings, where people do things. This is sort of a precursor to the temple, because remember, the temple doesn't exist in Jerusalem yet, okay? So chapter 14 now, Deuteronomy 14, we're going to look at verse 23, Deuteronomy 14:23 says this, "And before the Lord your God in the place that he will choose to make his name dwell there, you shall eat the tithe of your grain, of your wine, and of your oil, and of the firstborn of your herd and flock, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always." So yet another promise through Moses that the Lord will have a place established that people can come. This, again, sort of presupposes the temple and its construction, which we know that David will not build, but his son Solomon will build. A last couple of verses from the book of Deuteronomy, this coming from chapter 16. We're going to look at chapter 16, verses 2 and 6 from Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 16:2 reads, "And you shall offer the Passover sacrifice to the Lord your God from the flock of the herd at the place that the Lord will choose to make his name dwell there." So again, the Lord chooses a place to make his name dwell, in this case, the city of Jerusalem. And then finally, verse 6. "But at the place the Lord your God will choose to make his name dwell in it, there you shall offer the Passover sacrifice in the evening at sunset at the time you came out of Egypt." Okay. So a couple of places where God spoke through Moses as he wrote the book of Deuteronomy, that he would eventually establish a city, a place, a fixed location in which people could offer their sacrifices for their sins, where they could be cleansed by the priests, and the temple would be created. So we're getting that sort of set up here in chapters 6 and 7. I mentioned, we've read through chapter 6. I mentioned that chapter 7 is more about David. So 6 gets the ark to the city. 7 establishes the city as David being the one upon whom God is going to pour out his blessings. This is going to be the city of David. And through David, through the lineage of David, which if we skip forward to the New Testament, we would see that obviously we know this already. At Christmas time, we recount this, that Jesus was born in the city of David. Who was Joseph? Joseph was of the tribe and lineage of David. So Jesus is a descendant of David, and therefore David needs to be established. So that's really what's going to happen in chapter 7, is David's establishment. So these two chapters, as a unit, we're only covering one today, but these two chapters are a fulfillment of God's blessing, not just on David. You might look at it as though David is being exalted or exalting himself in some of this. This is on all the people, all Israel is what it's called here. But we got to remember that Israel is both the people of Israel at the time of David, at the time of Jesus, the time of Paul. But the new Israel, the true Israel, are all those who rely on God, Yahweh, the Lord of hosts, that we see in here. It's interesting that in the text we've seen this. This is another quick comment about all the overarching business here, but that Yahweh, the Lord of hosts, is the one who's mentioned. Yahweh Tzivaoth, the God of armies. We've heard that one already before. All right, I mentioned that I was going to come back to Psalm 132, which is really a psalm that covers over these two chapters, 6 and 7. And I want to read through this as well. So here we go, Psalm 132, and I'll read the entire psalm. Remember, O Lord, in David's favor, all the hardships he endured, how he swore to the Lord and vowed to the Mighty One of Jacob, I will not enter my house or get into my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling place for the Mighty One of Jacob. Behold, we heard it in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of Jaar. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness, and let your saints shout for joy, for the sake of your servant David. Do not turn away the face of your anointed one. The Lord swore to David a sure oath, from which he will not turn back. One of the sons of your body I will set on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant and my testimonies that I shall teach them, their sons also forever shall sit on your throne. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever. Here I will dwell, for I have desired it. I will abundantly bless her provisions. I will satisfy her poor with bread. Her priests I will clothe with salvation, and her saints will shout for joy. There I will make a horn to sprout for David. I have prepared a lamp for my anointed. His enemies I will clothe with shame, but on him his crown will shine. Thus far, Psalm 132. You see a lot of the allusions, not only to the time of David and the moving of the ark here and the work that David is doing, but what you see standing behind it is that God is the one doing the doing. God is the one using David to move the ark because God is the one who has chosen Zion. God's the one who's chosen David to be his servant to take the ark to Zion. So it's a nice picture of all this. There's a quick summary in the commentary about this too, where it says it mentions the ark in Ephrathah. Maybe you've heard that before, Bethlehem Ephrathah. It connects the two. And in Jaar, which is also Kiriath Jearim, it calls upon God to come to his resting place, and then it moves to Yahweh's promise to David in verses 11 and 12 of Psalm 132, which correlates with 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 to 16. It then climaxes with the messianic promise to make sprout a horn for David. That's Psalm 132:17. So therefore, David, as a depiction of a godly king in these two chapters, 6 and 7, isn't done to glorify David, but it's actually done to show that it's a fulfillment of God's glorification of himself through David by establishing this city. So anyway, that's sort of a nice overview of what we're going to see. Let's dig in here in a second to some of the details of chapter 6. Okay, let's look at the first 5 verses of chapter 6 here. This would be David's first attempt at bringing the ark into the city of Jerusalem. First of all, if you would want to read a parallel account of this, you would find it in 1 Chronicles 13, verses 1 through 8. We won't read that since we've already read the chapter here. What we find is that David initially assembles 30,000 men from all of Israel. And This references actually the previous chapter, chapter 5, where beginning in his reign of Israel, David had twice assembled an army to defeat the Philistines. That's in chapter 5, verses 17 through 25. But now David brought all these men together in order to deliver Yahweh, the Lord of hosts, Yahweh Tzivaoth, to Jerusalem. And the depiction is the movement of the ark from this place. It's called Baal Judah in there, but its more common name is Kiriath Jearim. And Kiriath Jearim, I'll try and put a map up here so you see that again. Kiriath Jearim is also mentioned in Psalm 132. So again, some of these things working together. Kiriath Jearim was territory that was part of the clans of Judah, and the author makes a nice connection to Kiriath Jearim being settled by the descendants of Shobal, a grandson of Caleb by his second wife Ephrath, and they would be distantly related to David in this area. David was an Ephrathite, descended from Ephrath through Salma, a grandson of Caleb, and he goes into great detail about all these connections of these this area being a part of the territory of David for centuries. Okay, so while it would appear as if David initially just wants to move the ark into a territory because he's got familial connection with this territory, we know otherwise, that the Lord is actually seeing to it that Zion has been chosen by him. That from Psalm 132. So this movement of the ark is an okay thing, but it's how the ark gets moved which sets us up really for a part of or at least the next chunk of what's going to happen to Uzzah. We have to have a little bit of an understanding of why Uzzah dies here. So we're going to do a little bit of background work right here. So David prepares to move the ark. He assembles all of Israel in order to help move the ark. And what he does is he builds a new cart to help the ark travel from Kiriath Jearim into Jerusalem. He builds a new cart so that there's no chance of an old cart which has perhaps been defiled to cause problems. This is sort of reminiscent of when the Philistines had actually captured the ark, and they had traveled with it on their own carts. And you remember what happened to them. That we would find in 1 Samuel chapter 6, verses 7 and 8. These Philistines were the people that David had already defeated, and so David didn't want to sort of redo the sin or recreate the sin that they had done by carrying the ark on a cart that had been defiled. So they build a new cart for it. The problem is that the ark is not to be carried on a cart at all. In order to check this out, we're going to go back to the book of Numbers here, and we're going to start with Numbers chapter 7. We're going to look at verses 6 through 9. There in Numbers chapter 7, what we learn is that all of the things of the tabernacle can be carried on carts, as the people Israel traveled, but not the ark itself. The ark itself was to be carried by Kohathite Levites. So we're going to see that here. So first we're going to see that you can carry things on carts. So this is Numbers chapter 7, verses 6 through 9. So Moses took the wagons and the oxen and gave them to the Levites. 2 wagons and 4 oxen he gave to the sons of Gershon according to their service, and 4 wagons and 8 oxen he gave to the sons of Merari according to their service, under the direction of Ithamar, the son of Aaron the priest. But to the sons of Kohath he gave none, because they were charged with the service of the holy things that had to be carried on the shoulder. Well, what are the holy things that have to be carried on the shoulder? You've probably guessed it by now. It's the ark itself. And in order to get to that, we're going to turn back to Numbers chapter 4. And in Numbers chapter 4, we're going to look at verse 15. Numbers 4:15 says this: When Aaron and his sons have finished covering the sanctuary and all its furnishings of the sanctuary, as the camp sets out after that, the sons of Kohath shall come to carry these. But they must not touch the holy things, lest they die. They are the things of the tent of meeting that the sons of Kohath are to carry. Actually, if you look at the whole, and we won't do this on the video here for the sake of time, but if you look at Numbers chapter 4, it's actually verses 1 through 15, which sort of detail all the work of the Kohathites, or the sons of Kohath, who have been given the duty or the responsibility of carrying the ark. In the design of the ark, there were holes that were fashioned on both sides where poles were slid through, and then the ark itself was carried on the shoulders of the Kohathites who were to carry it. What this is reminiscent of is how kings used to travel. Kings would travel seated on their throne, and they would be carried by their servants.
Let me guess. It must be Xerxes.
Well, if the ark, seated upon the wings of the seraphim, were to be the throne of God, well, then the Kohathites were charged with carrying the throne of God. So back to the text from 2 Samuel, lest we get a little too distracted here. David, in thinking he's going to move the ark up to Jerusalem from Kiriath Jearim, in doing so, he builds a new cart in order to carry it. And it's that piece that he misses, which the cart is actually, or the Ark of the Covenant is actually supposed to be carried. David misses that in the first pass here. So this helps to explain what we're going to find in the next section. This next section is about the death of Uzzah, verses 6 through 11 in 2 Samuel chapter 6. You'll find a parallel passage to this in 1 Chronicles 13, verses 9 to 14. And we've sort of set the stage for why Uzzah is going to die. They're transporting the ark on a cart, and they're supposed to be carrying it by hand on poles. Another place that you can see this is in Exodus chapter 25, verses 12 to 15, and as we've already referenced, Numbers chapter 4. They were taking charge of the procession, and although they were Judahites, they were not Kohathites, Kohathite Levites that had been given that privilege by God earlier. Uzzah made the mistake of touching the ark when it, stumbled or had started to fall. Even the Kohathite Levites were not allowed to touch it. We saw in Numbers 4:15. And so we see that that's really the cause of God's anger burning and dwelling on this. David had a reaction of anger in verse 8 of chapter 6. And some might think that, David's anger was directed towards God. It's a little bit ambiguous how it's written in there, but the text never says that. In fact, it's quite likely that David, his anger would have been towards Uzzah for not following the instructions that he should have known. Think about this for a minute. I mean, we have to do a lot of digging and we have to be educated. We have to educate ourselves on these matters about why would Uzzah die from this? Why would David be angry? This text that we're reading from 2 Samuel 6 doesn't even seem to make any sense to us. So we got to go do digging through the Bible to learn about all this. Look at the juxtaposition of the people in David's day. David would have been angry at Uzzah for not knowing this stuff already. It would have been that ingrained in them. They would have known it that well. I was sort of lamenting this, today. I was looking at some social media, and I saw a picture, not on social media, I was just looking at a news article. And there was a news article that I didn't go and look because you could take everything away from the title of the article, but someone was upset about some reality star or something had photoshopped a picture of themselves. And fans of this reality star had noticed the Photoshop fail because they noticed a rift in the picture. And what I thought to myself is what's relevant here. I thought, golly, man, if people, and this includes me too, I had to do the research to figure some of these things out and understand this text as well. And I'm a pastor, right? But I thought, if people would spend as much time, studying the Bible, learning the meaning behind some of these things, understanding stuff, as was expected of the people of old. We spend our time worrying about, studying a picture to see if they've photoshopped it of a star that we like to follow, or a reality star or something like that. Or, I hear the kids argue about, the canon of the story of Star Wars. Well, that's not part of the canon of the story, because they know the story of Star Wars so well that, they know if something belongs in the storyline or not. Or sports. I know back in my day, I don't know if it's as big a deal now, but like we would trade, baseball cards. And kids would know like stats on all their sports heroes. And they study this stuff ad nauseum. They can quote it off the top of their heads. And yet we don't know some of the truth of what God gives us in His Word of Scripture. We don't even know the history of some of this stuff. We have to go do some digging on this stuff. Whereas, like David, for instance, would have known it, would have thought on it. I don't want to excuse it. I realize we have a lot of time. They would have had more time on their hands to do this. They didn't have the distractions of this world. They didn't have the entertainment, like the sports or the reality stars or the television or things like that. They would have had the day-to-day living. Let's just survive the day. Let's raise a crop that we can eat. Let's raise livestock that we can make a living off of and eat. Let's struggle our way through the day. And for entertainment, certainly they played instruments. We learned in this chapter here, but also, they would study God's Word. They would study the things that were important. And in a way, I sort of long for that. I get to do it for my job, and I need to do it because I don't always do it. I have other things that distract me as well, but. Anyway, enough of the soapbox. Another possibility of David's anger being kindled over Uzzah's death would be that David would have been angry at himself for allowing himself to, as the leader, as the chosen king of Israel, allowing someone to be sort of lax in how they dealt with the ark. And angry because God had to have an outburst. So David could have been angry at himself as well. The text does say, and this is something, it doesn't say that David was angry at Uzzah, but it does say that David was angry. And then the next thing it says, if you look at verse 9, it says, David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David. But he took it aside into the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. So David could have been upset with himself, going, am I, questioning, am I supposed to be the one to do this? Why would I let this happen? Why should this happen under my watch? I think that's the sign of a good leader in David's case, is he's taking the responsibility upon himself for, even in a case like this, the difficulties that have occurred to his people under his watch. He needed to have some confidence that Jerusalem was the city, otherwise he himself could perish. And so he rightfully feared the Lord. So David wasn't willing to bring the ark into the city of Jerusalem, and instead he reroutes it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. To be a Gittite means you're from Gath, which you'll remember Gath was the home place of Goliath, whom David defeated. But Obed-Edom was not a Philistine. Obed-Edom was, actually what we learn, was a Kohathite. He was a Kohathite Levite, which makes sense why he would be the one to carry the ark, to care for the ark before it came up. He was, and we actually learn this from 1 Chronicles chapter 15. You'll see his name mentioned in 1 Chronicles 15 in verse 18, and then you see it listed also in verse 21. Again, this is the parallel version of the ark being brought up to Jerusalem, but so we get sort of the same story of what's going on, and even in chapter 14 you get the story of Uzzah, with initially the cart carrying the ark and Uzzah dying. You get all that in 1 Chronicles as well, but what we get more detail on in 1 Chronicles is that Obed-Edom was a Kohathite Levite, which made him capable then of carrying the ark. And it's why God blessed the presence of the ark in his household for that time. After that, we're told there's a period of 3 months that passes, that the ark remains with Edom, and word gets to David. The word gets to David that things are going well, and so David understands this as God's showing forgiveness for their mistakes that they had made, and he then chooses to move the ark up into the city of Jerusalem. A couple of quick things there with respect to that. David concludes that God has chosen Jerusalem as its dwelling place for the ark. We find this if you look at Psalm 84, verses 1 and 2. Psalm 84, 1 and 2 says, "How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts! My soul longs, yes, faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and flesh sing for joy to the living God." This is the way that we learn that David led the ark into the city. You also see that David, they only went, those who were carrying the ark. I know it says in the ESV version in verse 13, it says, "When those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal." The word bore actually comes or tells us that they were carrying the ark this time instead of putting it on a cart and driving it as they were doing in the previous attempt to bring it into Jerusalem. And there, of course, then David danced before the Lord. We get a little bit of foreshadowing here in verse 16 that as the ark of the Lord came into the city, Michal, Saul's daughter, David's wife, she sees this and she's despising David in her heart for the way that he's dancing. We're not told why or anything like this, but we will find out just in a little bit here what's going on. But at this part, we're not told why she despises David. We find out later in the chapter. Once inside the city of David, the ark was then placed into a tent. We're not told if it's a replacement of the tabernacle or if it's a new tent or anything like that. We're just told that it's a shelter for the tabernacle itself. And after that, the people offered burnt offerings. We see that in verse 18. He blessed the people. They offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. And David blessed the people in the name of Yahweh Tsevaoth. So he blessed them in the name of the Lord of hosts. On top of all this, then David also distributed rations, gave them food to celebrate this with a meal. This was not. This was sort of traditional to celebrate things, just like the Passover meal and things like that, to mark momentous events with a meal. And I suppose in many ways could be considered like a precursor to our modern potlucks, where we get together and we celebrate things with a meal. Sort of the last scene then that we have in this is, David and all the people of Israel go home to bless their households with all the things that have come as a result of the ark making it into the city of Jerusalem, with the food that's been distributed. David goes home as well, with intent, we see in verse 20, to bless his household. But what he finds there is Michal, the daughter of Saul, his wife. She comes out to meet him and she's upset. How is it that the king of Israel honored himself today by uncovering himself before the eyes of his servants, female servants? The verb actually used there is by exposing himself. So in his dancing, whether he did it by tearing off his clothing or whether he just accidentally exposed himself, we find out that's what Michal was upset about. So David says, "I was dancing before the Lord, who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will make merry before the Lord. I will make myself more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes." Basically what David is saying here is, listen, the judgment of God has been that he has chosen me, David, over your father, Saul, to be the successor, the king over all Israel. And that this judgment was not just one that lands on Saul himself, that he will not be the king over all Israel, but it falls to all those in his household. Think about his sons dying, by the sword on the same day. Now his daughter Michal not being able to bear children. The author he makes some commentary on this, saying, it's some people could assume that it's because David refuses to have conjugal rights with his wife at this point, or from this point forward. But then he also points out that if you look at 1 Samuel 25, verse 44, Paltiel was also a husband of hers. In 2 Samuel 3:15, we find that as well, that he served as a husband of hers, so that it wasn't necessarily that David didn't have conjugal rights with her, but that she was actually barren, which what we also know is that that's a judgment, that God would allow or would see at this time, is that women couldn't bear children. So that kind of gets we get up to the point that the ark has made it into the city, and then this ties us into chapter 7. So I guess a closing couple of thoughts here with all that we've seen go on here. One is never to forget the judgment of our Lord, and how strict and swift it can go, and that when we keep this in the cast or in the eyes of the first commandment, you shall have no other gods. What does this mean? We should fear and love God above all things. So that the fear of the Lord is really what determines stage one for the faithful, is that we have a healthy and a reverent fear of God. The act of Uzzah in this, while it appears to be not a serious offense, we find that it is outside of God's directions. Well, what are God's directions for us? We shouldn't, sin indiscriminately or without thinking. Consider Romans chapter 6, the beginning of Romans 6. Shall we go on sinning so that Christ's grace may increase? By no means. Me genoito is the Greek that Paul uses, which is an emphatic no, absolutely not. By no means should we go on sinning just because we know that Christ's grace has covered us. That would be living with a lack of fear. But with the proper fear, then we also properly know that our God is the one who has rescued and redeemed us. We see a theme of forgiveness, redemption, through God relenting from his anger, shown at Uzzah, and then with Obed-Edom, who then takes the ark into his place, and then they deliver it into the city of Jerusalem properly. We see that God is willing to forgive. We see the joy that David shows in his dancing for the Lord, dancing before the ark, leading it into the city. Which reminds me, that's another point that should be brought out. David, it was said, was wearing a linen ephod. It tells us in verse 14. This would be typically clothing that was worn by the priests. And then there's this discussion about whether David served as a king or as a priest. Think of it in our day like how a pastor is robed in church. The pastor is doing, there's purpose behind all the clothing that the pastor wears. So the white alb that we wear, the robe that we wear, that covers over the black collar, or the black clerical with a white tab collar. The white tab collar covers our voice box because we're covered in darkness of sin, but through the word that we speak, that little white tab that covers our voice box, that's a reminder that the light shines in the darkness and the darkness shall not overcome it. We then, when we dress for worship, we cover ourselves with this white linen robe or alb, which demonstrates that God's faithfulness, righteousness has covered over all of our sins. The stole that goes over our shoulders, then, that we wear once we're ordained, is a reminder. It's meant to look like a harness for like a working animal, like an ox. So we're harnessed by this word. We're contained or constrained by this word. We can only say what the word says. And then you see like the cross that we'll wear, the pectoral cross that we wear. That our cross is the reminder that the cross of Christ and what occurred there at the cross of Christ has covered over our sins, and it's the reason for restoration and our good standing before the Lord is on account of what Christ has done. Well, that's all that David was really doing here. Was he was wearing a high priest, not the high priest's ephod, but he was covering himself with the robe. Don't think of a pastor. Think of like an acolyte. An acolyte who, they cover themselves in a white robe when they're seated in the chancel space because they've come up to light the candles in service to the Lord during the service of, the service of the Word that we engage in together. I guess the last thing to cover here is the Christ figure. Where's the Christ figure in this? Which is the question I always like to sort of arrive at the end of each of these. And I would suggest that the Christ figure is that we see the fulfillment of prophecy, that Jesus himself is indeed the fulfillment of all these prophecies, that this city of David would be the place and the lineage from which Christ himself would come. We see the forgiveness of David, after having sinned, and the grace of God shown, which is shown to us through Christ. And I think those are probably the closest touchstones to some of the that link to Jesus that we want to see. I think that's all I'm going to cover for now. Certainly, as always, invite you to put questions, thoughts down in the section down below in the questions and comments section of YouTube, and we'll try and engage that way. Until we meet again, blessings to you. Thanks.